Hey, good afternoon. I'm so pleased to see so many of you. I was predicting an audience of 4, including my mother online. So, first of all, a huge thank you to Kristen Hoskins and Paige Moreau for their consummately professional and kind organization of this program. And what can I say? I apologize in advance for those of you who came to this talk anticipating that you would be able to learn a great deal about what the title calls the archaeology of Jewish life. What I have to present for you this afternoon is both a detective story and a court case. We've had many of those recently. And as you know, evidence, another noun in the title, in either a detective story or a court case, can either confirm or deny one's preconceptions. So in short, you may not learn that much about what Jewish life was like materially in the Middle Ages from the material that I present as evidence, but I warrant you will learn something even more interesting. Jews, as you may know, were a demographic minority in the European Middle Ages, occasionally envied, sometimes despised and persecuted, usually misunderstood. The pervasively Christian culture within which Jews lived constantly proclaimed the dominance of Christians and Christianity over Jews and Judaism. In a barrage of public contexts, Jews were daily faced with images such as that of the accursed and rejected synagogue. You see her here on the right. The church, ecclesia, is standing erect. She's elegantly coiffed. She's carrying a chalice and a Eucharistic host. She bears a staff with a cross at the top. Synagogue, the synagogue representing the Jewish people and their religion, is bent over with the weight of the tablets of the law, which are too heavy for her to hold. She's wearing a parody of the high priest's garment. She is wearing a turban because Jews, Muslims, what's the difference, right? You know, that was a medieval, actual medieval problem, was actually distinguishing often Saracens, Muslims, or Hagarites as they were called, from Jews. You know the old joke that there's a guy walks into a restaurant, sits down, and there's an Asian guy sitting at a table next to him. The guy walked in, was Jewish. Gets up, the Jewish guy, walks over to the Asian guy, punches the Asian guy in the face. The Asian guy says, "What was that for?" Jewish guy says, "That was for Pearl Harbor." The Asian guy says, "Pearl Harbor, that was the Japanese, I'm Chinese." Jewish guy says, "Chinese, Japanese, what's the difference?" Sits down. 5 minutes later, the Chinese guy, right, gets up, punches the Jewish guy in the nose. The Jewish guy goes, "What was that for?" Chinese guy goes, "That was for the Titanic." Jewish guy is, "Wait, the Titanic, that was an iceberg." Chinese guy goes, "Iceberg, Goldberg, what's the difference," right? So there was some you could say commonality between Jews and Muslims in the Middle Ages, in which they were confused with each other as exotic Easterners. And most importantly, synagogue is blindfolded, because the Jews, in spite of the fact that Jesus has come and grace has suffused the world, are still unable to see or perceive this, and thus are blind. And thus, in the Good Friday liturgy, they are prayed for, right, before Vatican II, with the words, "May God heal the blindness of this people, that they come and see the truth of Jesus." Many other examples, this one famously from Strasbourg Cathedral. She doesn't look happy. It is a tour de force, though, because you can see the eyes underneath. This is stonework, right? Underneath the blindfold. Jews also were presented with images of the Jewish tormentors of Jesus. Here you have Caiaphas, the high priest, indicting Jesus, and the Jews here are all dark, right? They all have animalistic features, and Jesus is a little, a pasty-faced white boy, right? or any of the horrible accusations that were leveled against Jews in the Middle Ages, including accusations of ritual murder, which also involved circumcision in the accounts of Christians libeling Jews, such as here, Simon of Trent, a very famous case. And Jews face the sometimes terrible consequences of these hatreds and libels against them. It's interesting that in these two images, these are both from the Weltchronik, which is the earliest illustrated printed book ever made. And it was felt important to the authorship of this book to include these two very powerful images of, and some more actually, of Jewish quote-unquote crimes and their repercussions in this very first book. This is a very early instance of fake news, as you see. But this is not to say that every day was a vale of tears for medieval Jews. When I was bar mitzvah, some well-meaning and cheery relative gave me a book by Simon Wiesenthal titled Every Day a Memorial Day. And what it was a book in which every page contained a day of the year, January 1st, January 2nd, all through December 31st, and described some horrible massacre, murder, or pogrom that had happened to Jews somewhere at some time on that date. And, you know, for me, that was kind of a wake-up call. I thought it was bad for Jews, but I didn't realize it was that bad. I lived in Brooklyn. These things didn't happen that often or at all. It took me years, but I began to realize through my study of the Middle Ages that not every day was a Memorial Day, right? Jews in the Middle Ages lived alongside their neighbors. Most days, they weren't being accused of blood libels or being burned. Most days they learned and prayed and did business and played along with others, right, plays well with others, and lived their very own dynamic and creative lives. Most days they enjoyed good or decent relations with their Christian neighbors. Most days they bought and sold, and some days, some of them, the very creme de la creme, the wealthiest elites, commissioned manuscripts. And in spite of those dark days, Jews persevered in preserving their dignity and in perpetuating a positive national self-perception. There's a famous fable from Aesop that tells of a lion journeying with a man. And this is in the days that lions and humans got along, right? And as they walked along, each of them was boasting about himself. And alongside the road, they found a stone carving depicting a man strangling a lion. "You see," said the man, "this proves that we men are stronger than you lions and more powerful than any animal." The lion replied, "Images like this were made by you. If lions could carve stones, you would see all the lions winning." And proceeded, without much more ado, to knock the man to the ground and devour him. So Jewish tradition described Jews as the lions of Judah, promising them that they had been chosen by God from among the nations of the earth, promising them that the end of the story would be a positive one for them in spite of the terrible persecution they would have to endure. It would have only been natural for people in such a position to think, as did the lion in Aesop's fable, images like this were all made by you. If we, the Jews, were the ones making the monuments, you would see us in a position of dominance. So what we see in art commissioned and sometimes made by Jews, more often commissioned from others, which is really fascinating, actually, because it shows that after the rise of secular manuscript workshops, by secular I mean manuscript workshops that were not in monasteries, Around 1300, 1280 or 1300, there were manuscript workshops no longer only in monasteries, but along the cathedral or high streets of all the towns of Europe. And the Jews who lived in the shadow of the great cathedrals, because the church was bound to protect the Jews physically. You may not know that. That was the deal that the church had. The Jews had to be preserved physically so that they could be pointed to, and one could say, this is what your life will be like if you do not accept Christ, right? So kept alive in a legally abjected, that is suppressed state, but kept alive. And the place you could be safest as a Jew against the forces of the secular monarchy and of the mob was in the shadow of the great cathedrals. So the Jews lived there. Business was conducted there. The manuscript workshops were there. And any Jew with sufficient wherewithal could walk into a manuscript workshop after about 1280, plunk a bag of cash on the table and say, I want a manuscript. And the person who owned the shop would create the manuscript, and they'd have to have a discussion. What would you like? Oh, I'd like a Haggadah. A Hawada? A Haggadah. What is that? Oh, it's like a prayer book. Oh, you mean a book of hours? Well, no, not quite a book of hours. It's a prayer book. I guess it's like a book of hours because you would use it at home. It's for Pesach. Pesach? You know, Pak. Oh, Easter. Yes, right? So, this whole negotiation went on, and eventually Jews were able to commission manuscripts from the Christian artisans. So what we see in this art, whether the images are relatively close to the reality of medieval or early modern Jewish life, or imaginatively distant from it, is first and foremost the impulse not to illustrate reality, but to expose the inner lives of the people who inspired and paid for, very important, these exquisite volumes. Bernard Berenson, not unknown in Boston, put it best when he said, art is based not on the actuality, but on the wishes, dreams, and aspirations of a people. Sometimes this is more important, even, than being able to reconstruct the reality of their lives. So text and images in medieval manuscripts made for and sometimes by Jews are in relationship, but they are not inseparable. What about history and so-called details of everyday life? Are they not inevitably and inexorably bound to the image? Is not what we see in the image a reflection of the lives of the people who created the image? Well, it is, but in a subtle way. And I'm looking out at all of you, and I can tell that you're people who will get subtlety, right? So I want to talk about the way in which art is only sometimes a mirror of the world outside the page, but that it is always a projector. What do I mean by that? I had an ongoing argument with the late Vivian Mann, who was the curator for many years of Judaica at New York's Jewish Museum, who maintained that the patrons of medieval manuscripts made for Jews must have owned objects like we see in the manuscripts, that is, lavers, hand-washing bowls, right? Double cups, particular kinds of table linens, because archaeologists had found similar objects in various excavations of formerly Jewish sites in Europe. At right, by the way, we're looking at an image from a very strange manuscript called the Griffin's Head Haggadah. It's a Haggadah, a book for the home service for the eve of Passover, and we'll have more occasion to talk about it in a bit. It was created in the territory now covered by parts of France and Germany, then called by its Jewish inhabitants Ashkenaz, with the adjective Ashkenazi. More specifically, that manuscript was made in Mainz around 1300. We'll return to this manuscript in more detail as we proceed, but for the moment, let us simply note that all the Jews depicted in this book have the heads of griffins. In spite of their strange appearance, they are shown going about the business of Passover preparations. Oh my God, it's like 33 days, right? Passover preparations and celebrations in what appear to be contemporary interior settings. Vivian, curator of the Jewish Museum, now deceased, insisted that since a double cup had been found in the 14th century Jewish treasure hoard from Erfurt, Germany. And let me explain that what happened with Jewish communities was the following. Jews were often limited by law in their professions. They might be able to sell old clothes but not new clothes. They might be able to sell eggs but not chickens, right? And they were able to lend money at interest because Christians' understanding of canon law, that is Christian church law, was that Christians could not lend money to each other, and so at interest, and so Jews fell into that profession or were sort of restricted to that profession in many places. And it was interesting because one could not only earn one's living in that profession but become wealthy, but it was a precarious sort of wealth, as we'll discuss as we go on, which means I take your pledge, you give me something, a silver vessel, a crucifix, right? I give you money, more money than you have, money that you need, more than the value of the object, and you pay me back at interest. But what is to stop you, if you're a Christian knight, from coming with your entourage, taking back your pledge, right, taking all the money in the shop and killing me? Nothing is to stop you. And so it was a precarious kind of way of making a living. And very often, when mobs of Christians came to town, particularly in the states that became the German territories and French territories, Jews would have to flee. And sometimes they buried everything that they had taken as pledges or had in their households in a place that they thought they would come back and recover such things. Well, very often they didn't, and we have found several hoards of objects that belong to Jews, not necessarily Jewish objects, but objects that belong to Jews, buried underground in various places in Germany. Usually what happens is somebody is digging to build a parking facility, and they discover these things, and the work has to stop because they're very strict in Germany about national patrimony, and Jewish patrimony is part of that. And so, these things are dug up, and they're in museums, and books have been written about them. So Vivian insisted that because in this late 14th century Jewish treasure hoard from Erfurt, Germany, there had been a double cup, that is a cup that has a bottom and a top on it, that the double cups depicted in the Griffin's Head Haggadah, and you see what she described as a double cup there on the left, were evidence that the patrons of the manuscripts owned such double cups. Here's a photo of the two halves of the rather crushed double cup from the Erfurt hoard, which before it was damaged might have looked similar to the famous Cloisters double cup in New York. It's a really weird object. It's inscribed with the names of the three magi, right? Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, right? Thank you. It's inscribed in yellow and gold. And the top has a coat of arms that has three Jewish hats, as you can see in it. It's an interesting object. But I found Vivian's argument, suggestion, problematic on a couple of counts. First of all, the two images she read as depicting double cups, in fact, depict no such thing. One, for the final cup of the Seder, where at the end of the Seder, one says, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, which means within the coming year may we be in Jerusalem, right? Not next year in Jerusalem. That's a mistranslation. Within the coming year may we be in Jerusalem. The one for the final cup of the Seder depicts a tankard, like a beer stein, right? With a foot, as you see Can I do this? Let's see. Let's see how good I am at this. Right, with a foot, okay, an open top, and a handle. It's not a double cup. It's a tankard, right? And a decorative band, incidentally, around the middle, which seems to have confused Vivian, who is beyond confusion now. So she's, The other depicts what is clearly a lantern with a chimney on the top. So this is a good story. When I was in Jerusalem living for a couple of years, I wanted to go see this manuscript at the Israel Museum. The curator here is going to blanch at this, but the curator then, whose name I won't mention because I don't want to get in trouble because she was so nice. I had a scam. See, I wanted my kid. My middle son, Gabi, who was then about 6 years old, I wanted him to see the manuscript, right? So I was going to go see it on a Monday when it was off display. They were going to take it down and show it to me. So I called the curator and I said to her, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to come in this morning, but my wife is ill and I have the kid and I don't know what to do." And as I predicted to myself, because she's such a nice person, she said, "Just come in." Right? So I came in with the kid, and I seated him in the corner on a high stool, and I proceeded to thumb through the manuscript with my grubby hands, right? And the whole time, he is in the corner. I should have brought a picture because he was so adorable, right? And he's like, he wants to see it, he wants to see it. So finally she said, "Okay, come over and take a look." So we ended up on this page. I said to him, "Look, Gabi, this is very interesting. This man has a double cup. It's a cup with a lid on it. Maybe you use it to keep flies off the wine, or at a wedding when you use two cups, right? You might want to pour wine from one cup to the other." He said, "Abba," he was 6. He said, "Abba, Dad," he said, that's not a double cup." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "It's a lantern." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, first of all, it's gold, and none of the other cups in the book are gold, right? Second of all, right, the man is looking at his fingers in its light, at his fingernails." He said, "And thirdly, it says right on top, Borei Me'orei Ha'esh." He could read that at 6, right? Which means creator of the flames of fire. So, the Sabbath, the seventh day, has its inception at the time that the sun touches the tops of the trees, which varies during the year, right? It's twilight. And it ends when there are 3 stars in the sky. And to distinguish the Sabbath from the rest of the days of the week, you do a little ceremony in which you relight a fire, which you haven't been able to do all of the Sabbath, and you look at your fingernails, which reflect the light, in the light of the flame, right? And you say the blessing, "Thank you, God, for creating the flame of fire." And so, out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, the kid was absolutely correct. This isn't a double cup, it's a lantern, right? And I think it was just a wonderful answer to Vivian. So there aren't double cups in the manuscript, right? Moreover, the illuminations of cups in the Bird's Head Haggadah, or the Griffin's Head Haggadah. The Israel Museum calls it the Bird's Head Haggadah. I call it the Griffin's Head Haggadah. These are griffins. You don't know any birds that have human bodies or lion ears or manes, okay? But these illustrations of cups, wherever they appear, do not come primarily to accurately depict the realities of Jewish life. For instance, we are not looking at a 14th century Ashkenazic Passover Seder on this page, right? Jews in 14th century Ashkenaz were forbidden to consume a roast, it's red, that's how we know it's roasted, a roast lamb at the Seder. They couldn't eat sheep or goats at the Seder. It was too close to the Passover sacrifice. And since the Messiah had not come and the Passover sacrifice was not reinstituted, it was not the custom, strongly not the custom, to eat roasted animals, particularly never sheep or goats on Passover. So I have argued that this image must represent the Messianic Passover, the future Passover sacrifice, with a large ram with gigantic yellow horns to distinguish it from the lamb, which might have been viewed as a, what? Symbol of Jesus, right? And as it's brought to the table, the participants celebrate with the prescribed 4 cups. But the man who brings in the Passover sacrifice brings an additional cup, which is the cup called the cup of redemption that the Jews associated with Messianic era. So nothing in this is a mirror of 14th century Jewish life. It's rather a projection of what Jews imagined Jewish life would be in the Messianic era with the restoration of the Passover sacrifice. Another interesting fact here is that there are women sitting at the table along with men, and they too are raising cups, which is something that did not necessarily occur in the Seder in 14th century. Right? I would argue against Vivian that rather than depicting themselves as owning various types of accoutrement, say double cups, the Jews who commissioned this, and indeed any manuscript, rather chose to depict themselves as, now this is subtle, but you're good at subtleties, right? The kind of people who would own particular accoutrement. So not people who owned particular accoutrement necessarily, but the kind, the class of people who would have owned them. On the surface, the argument seems to hinge upon an unnecessarily fine and perhaps even somewhat silly distinction. How could she contend that the particular patrons about which nothing is known definitely owned particular objects just because we see images of similar objects in the manuscripts they commissioned? On the other hand, arguing against myself, how could I prove that they did not own such objects? And moreover, why was it not particularly important whether they actually did or did not own them, but rather that they wanted to display themselves as the kinds of people who did? As I have said, all we can conjecture is that the patrons of the manuscript wanted to project themselves as the kind of people who would have owned objects like those depicted. For me, what was at stake was the question of whether a manuscript is, in the final analysis, a mirror or a projector. To my mind, the idea that manuscripts were mirrors was, to begin with, problematic. A mirror, as St. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians, is always dim, distorting, and reversing. Paul says, now we see as through a glass darkly, but in the future we will see direct and clear, right? But even beyond that, using mirror in the common sense of advancing an accurate representation, I disputed the wildly held assumption, promulgated in large part by sort of archaeological art historians like Vivian of blessed memory, that Jewish art is necessarily a mirror of Jewish life, revealing the details of the Jewish home surroundings, how Jews lived, what they wore, and what their households looked like. Right? For me, I proposed replacing the paradigm of the mirror with that of the projector, in which images display for the patrons, for their circle, for us, for posterity, first and foremost, the wishes, dreams, and aspirations and ambitions of the people who commission them. Art, in other words, is to be understood as evidence of the things the patrons desired to say about themselves and to project to viewers and to be remembered in history. Everything we see that is apparently a representation is also an aspiration. We exchanged some high-pitched rhetoric about this matter for a while, and what came clear is that neither of us was right about how one should approach these manuscripts and artifacts. It was a matter of outlook, perspective, and preference. But one major difference between our approaches to our approaches was that Vivian was convinced that hers was correct, and moreover scientific, because backed up by corroborating material evidence. When we look at manuscripts, we see what was there in life, she said. I conceded that this may in some cases be true, but I continued to press her. In the Griffin's Head Haggadah, the Jewish figures, even though they have these bizarre faces, are always depicted with blonde hair. Was this actual, Vivian, or aspirational? In other words, irregardless of their actual, probably variety of hair color, blonde hair was part of the general standard of beauty in 14th century minds, to which these idealizing figures seem to have aspired. Well, she conceded, we could not know this because we had no archaeological evidence, but it was certainly possible that these Jews, being Northern European, had been blonde. Okay. All of them? I probed. I'll agree to that, I told her, if you will agree that they all had griffins' heads. What could she say to that? It would, I think you'd agree, be a very strange prospect indeed. Yet, logically speaking, if we maintain that a manuscript is always and everywhere primarily a mirror, we would have to believe that all Jews in 14th century Mainz had griffin heads. In sum, I have no doubt that pre-modern art can be, and sometimes is, representational. But it's more often aspirational, and I put it to you that the reconstruction, tentative as it may be, of the motivations and aspirations of Jewish patrons is an infinitely richer and more intellectually captivating endeavor than the reconstruction of the contents of their china cabinets. Let me give you an example from the 14th century Golden Haggadah, so-called, made in Barcelona in Spain to balance out all that Ashkenazi stuff. The Jewish manuscripts span the world. It depicts the plague of frogs per the biblical account, right? With the frogs swarming from the Nile into the houses of the Egyptians and the palace of Pharaoh. But it also shows the scene per rabbinic legend as occurring with a single gigantic frog. There's a single gigantic frog, and Aaron holding his rod is hitting the frog, and all the other frogs are proceeding out of the single gigantic frog. This is the result of a grammatical problem in the biblical text. It said, I can tell it to you because you're all not only subtle but intelligent, right? So I don't have to skip over the details. It says in the text of the plague, Vata'al hatzifardea, the frog came out of the Nile, right? So what's the plural of fish? Well, technically the plural of fish is fishes, as we see in earlier English, but the plural came to be, the singular came to be used as the plural. Same with deer. There is a plural, deers, which Elizabethans used all the time, but we now say deer. In biblical Hebrew, it's no different. When the frog emerges, it means the collective plague of frogs, right? But the rabbis, with their playful imagination, seized on this and said that there was one gigantic gesunte behema of a frog, right, that emerged from the Nile, and all the other frogs came out of it when they hit that one frog. Okay. So I was once lecturing on this image many years ago at some much fancier institution than this. I think it was the Jewish Museum in New York. Anyway, you know, before a much more erudite and, what did I call you, subtle and intelligent crowd, I'm sure. And the place was full, I mean packed, not like this, spotty, right? And in the front row, my then 8-year-old daughter, I end up talking a lot about my kids, right, and their observations, was sitting. And I was showing the image and the big frog, right, and she's got her hand up. I'm like, oh my God, girl has to go to the bathroom, I'm sure. So I said, Chevy, can I help you? Do you need? She said, Abba. And you know how it is at home when your kids are annoying, you could tell them like, shut up, you know, stop that, it's enough, right? But when you're in public, you have to be the perfect parents, you know? So it's like, yes, Chevy, do you have an observation that you'd like to share with the group, right? And she did. She said, Abba, I've been looking at the picture and I see that there is a big frog, but it's funny because Aaron is hitting the big frog on its head because we can see it has 2 googly eyes here, see? And all the little frogs are coming out of the big frog's tushy, right, out of its rear end. You know what? She's right. This illustration does a lot of interesting things. First, it illustrates the biblical verse, right? Then it illustrates the rabbinic story of the giant frog, the Midrash it's called, right? And then it does yet another thing, which is it gives an enormous, I don't want to make the rude gesture, but let's just use the initials, F-U to Pharaoh and all those evil, wicked, oppressive Egyptians, because if frogs are gross, there's nothing grosser than ass frogs, okay? These are frogs shooting out of the posterior of another frog, and they're hitting, you know, the Egyptians in their head. They almost hit Pharaoh in the face, right? This is such a great illustration. It does so many interesting things, and this subtle detail that my 8-year-old noticed, right, you have to be an 8-year-old, I guess, demonstrates the playfulness of the authorship of this manuscript. By authorship, I mean all the people who collaborated on it, in highlighting the repulsiveness of the plague in spite of the fact that everybody is very courtly and dignified in the illustrations. Okay. So, since the Seder is a ceremony that takes place in the home, Haggadot, the service for the Seder, from the 14th through the 18th centuries contained depictions of the rituals of Passover Eve being carried out by the manuscript's patrons, or figures that serve to represent Jews of their milieu, in what is ostensibly the household of the manuscript's patrons. And it's tempting to think of those illustrations as mirrors of Jewish life in the Middle Ages, as indeed most scholars, B.E., it's a technical term, it means before Epstein, most scholars before me have tended to do. By the way, I just want, you guys are privileged because you are learning from me, and I am at the very pinnacle of my field. I have to tell you what it's like. Give me a second to reflect. It's like living in the penthouse apartment of a 1-story building. There's only like 6 other people in the world who care about this stuff at all. So, you know, when I say that before me, people hadn't thought about it this way, it's not such a big deal, right? Most scholars thought of these things as mirrors of what was going on in the lives of these people, and it's true. It's true. I'm sure there are details that reflect the details of their homes, but there's so much more. I want to concentrate now on what is not actually a medieval but an early modern example, a manuscript created after the advent of printing. So imagine you have printing come in and people are like, I'm done with all those handwritten manuscripts. They're beautiful, but the sexiest, newest thing, you know, is you have to have an electrical car that plugs into the cloud, whatever it is, right? You know, I want to have a printed book, right? And then other people are like, oh man, you know, I'm going back to, I'm a retro kind of guy, right? You know, I want to go back to the, right? So people had manuscripts commissioned even after printing came in. And this illustration comes from the so-called Second Cincinnati Haggadah, written and illustrated not in Cincinnati, that's where it's held today, by a fellow named Moshe Leib, son of Wolf of Trebitsch, probably in Moravia, in 1717. And the audience, an unidentified but well-heeled and well-connected family, possibly named Falk, is clearly meant to identify with the figures in the illustrations. Iris Fischoff, in her catalog for the 1996-97 Court Jews exhibition at New York's Jewish Museum, writes, quote, "The whole scene may reflect the lifestyle of the Haggadah's owners," unquote. Yet, is a manuscript a mirror? Can we assume that these figures are straightforward depictions of the ways in which patrons typically dressed and lived? What can an examination of this image tell us about the quote-unquote historical realities of Jewish life? I'll return to that image from 18th century Moravia, but first I want to look at and get into an earlier image from 14th century Italy in order to reveal some of the inherent problems and pitfalls in attempting to use manuscripts as mirrors. Famous book in the 80s by Therese and Mendel Metzger called Jewish Life in the Middle Ages, in which the authors assert that this image from the so-called Rothschild Miscellany, illuminated in Ferrara around 1478, probably by one of the Bellini family. In this image, the artist commits what is an obvious faux pas by showing a mezuzah on a door in an upright position, when everyone knows that a mezuzah has to slant into the house, right? So obviously, this manuscript created by non-Jews for Jewish patrons makes an error, makes a mistake. Okay? Well, not true. Not true at all. The Talmud has some opinions about how mezuzahs should be affixed, but the central argument is between a very important scholar from France, from the 11th or 12th century, called Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, and his grandson, a little bit later, Rabbeinu Tam. Rashi says the mezuzah should go straight up and down, right? The Talmud seems to indicate that the mezuzah should go across this way because the text is written this way, right? If it's straight up and down, it's weird, right? Why would you put a text that's written this way horizontally? Why would you put it vertically? Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, resolves the problem by saying it should go in between the opinion of the Talmud and his grandfather, and it should lean, okay? Ashkenazic Jews accepted the custom, not the law, of the leaning mezuzah, whereas Sephardic and Italian Jews will put a mezuzah straight up and down in a doorway. So in fact, in spite of the fact that it's a non-Jewish artist, this illustration depicts accurately how the mezuzah is placed in Ferrara in 1478. So, now we have a reliable witness. This manuscript is very reliable. It must tell us exactly what we are seeing all the time. And look at this depiction from the same manuscript. This is a depiction of Job's property from illuminations of the book of Job in that same Rothschild Miscellany. We see a beautiful courtly landscape in which some scholars have described as accurately representing the sort of cultural estate owned by the social class of Jews like those who commissioned the manuscript. But are these scenes intended to represent nature in a realistic or idealized fashion? In this particular case, it is clear that the depiction represents not a natural, but a preternaturally, supernaturally bounteous world. And how do I know that? The caption reads, Le'Yov HaMishneh. That is, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. You know the book of Job, very famous book of the Bible, in which the hindering angel called the Satan comes before God and says, God, you have this favorite guy. He lives in the land of Uz. He's not an Israelite. His name is Job. He has everything. You give him everything because he's so pious and he loves you. what would it be if you took everything away? And God says, nothing would happen. He'd still love me. And Satan says, well, I'm sure he would curse you and die. So God says, okay, do your job, Satan. You go down and you take everything away from Job. And he does. Job is left bereft of all his property, of all his children, of all, right? But at the end of the story, because Job refuses to curse God, right, he is restored. L'Iyov HaMishneh, Job gets twice as much as he had before. So this illustration isn't an illustration of what a person has, but twice as much. And thus, the illumination intended to represent the supernaturally augmented and enhanced property of Job, not the real world at all. So we can accordingly learn very little from this image about the nature of estates, Jewish or otherwise, in northern Italy in 1478, about the clothing of the peasants or about the weather, right? But we can learn that the patron of this manuscript imagined a supernaturally lush and beautiful setting in the way we can learn what paradise looked like for the 14th century Christian viewers of Jean-Duc de Berry's estates in his Très Riche Heures, right? Or the Ghent altarpieces depiction of heaven, right? So it's interesting. In the same manuscript, we have an image that we think is inaccurate because we know how the mezuzah goes that turns out to be accurate. So we say, oh, right, this manuscript is accurate about all its depictions. And then we come to the depiction of Job's property, right? And we say, it's not an accurate depiction of anything. It's an aspirational depiction in the way that the peasants in Jean de Berry's estates did not dress in lapis blue garments, right? Or, well, we don't know what heaven looks like, but, does heaven look like a manicured, greensward in an early Netherlandish town? Aspirational, not realia. There are many other scenes of wishful thinking on the part of illuminators and patrons in the corpus of Jewish manuscript illumination. We have medieval Spanish Haggadot depicting armed Jews looting Egypt, right? This is also because of the biblical passage. It says, "V'hamushim alu b'nei Yisrael eretz Mitzrayim." The people of Israel left Egypt hamushim. So hamushim comes from, according to Rashi, that commentator I mentioned, hamishim in groups of 50, like an army, he says, that moves in groups of 50, or hamushim wearing weapons, right? But this is wishful thinking because Jews in the Middle Ages were not allowed to bear weapons in all of the places they lived. We have the famous Darmstadt Haggadah, which depicts women teaching men, right? In what can only be described as a yeshiva-like setting, not a thing that actually occurred in the Middle Ages, aspirational. Clearly, the patron is a woman who's imagining a world like 21st century America, where my Hungarian-born wife is a professor of Talmud, also has ordination as an Orthodox rabbi, right? Couldn't happen in the Middle Ages, but this person was imagining it. And we have the 18th century Central European illuminations of sumptuous Seder tables in exquisitely courtly milieus, which we began with and to which we will return. I would argue that all of these do less to reveal life as it was than to illuminate the manner in which the authorship of these works desired to depict themselves. Even Moritzi Gottlieb's famously quote-unquote realistic depiction of Yom Kippur in an East European synagogue serves not as an accurate reflection of reality. Ezra Mendelsohn and Richard Cohn have discussed the strangely colorful and striped kittel, ritual garment, on the central figure, the abbreviated mechitzah, that is the separation of men and women so that you could actually see the women, and the inscriptions on the Torah mantle and other elements that point away from realism and towards self-referential and explicitly allegorical context for understanding this painting. The central figure in the coat of many colors is the artist, Gottlieb himself, betrayed, like that other wearer of a coat of many colors, like Joseph, by his brethren, but most particularly by the woman standing on the far left, right, of whom the uncurtained women's section enables us a full view, right, and wishing he was dead, as the inscription on the Torah mantle indicates when it refers to Gottlieb as deceased, using his own Hebrew name, and exhorts us to pray for his soul. What happened was that Gottlieb came from an ultra-Orthodox background, as I do. He became an artist, not an art historian. He wanted to marry this woman, but her mother, look at her, right? Say no more, right? Her mother, on advice of her sister, who was jealous, right, put a kibosh on the marriage, said it was pasnish, it's not appropriate to marry him because he's not so frum, he's not so religious. And Gottlieb went out, painted this painting, went out at night in a storm without a hat. If you're a mother or a grandmother, you know what that means, right? And he contracted pneumonia and he died. And on the Torah scroll, which is held on the left shoulder, not the right shoulder of this gentleman, it says, "In memory of the immortal soul of Maritzi Gottlieb." He was a very young man. So this painting, just like the frogs, remember the ass frogs, okay? This painting is an enormous F-U, pardon me, enormous F-U to that community in which Gottlieb came up. Right? It looks like Kol Nidre, right? You could hear the Yom Kippur liturgy. It looks so nostalgic. It's the Tel Aviv Museum, where this is housed, sells music boxes that play Kol Nidre with this on the cover, right? But this is a really enormous FU to that very community, right? So that's what art can do, right? And in the case of our 18th century illustrations, the extravagance and the ostentatious display here has a parallel with another aspect of Passover practice, the custom of displaying one's most lavish and precious housewares in the home during the Seder, quote unquote, vessels of silver and gold. Not because this is the way in which one always entertained. Right? When I was a kid, my father would show me these illustrations. He would say, "See, Marc, this is how Jews lived in the old days. Beautiful houses, beautiful equipment," right? No, right? One displayed one's best on Passover because it was unusual to make the children ask the question, why are we getting gussied up like this? Passover was a time to show another face, the face of free people in stark contradistinction to the life of enslavement. Though such illustrations of ritual in contemporary garb, if they have been considered at all, have by and large been mined by previous scholars as concrete evidence of social mores and material culture, we ought to resist the temptation, as I have been arguing, to do so and understand that they may depict an ideal rather than a real world. The 19th century European Rebbe Menachem Mendel of Kotsk was once rumored to have asked his students which was the most difficult Jewish holiday to observe. They answered that it was Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, because it required the erstwhile householder to leave the warm comforts of home to dwell in a fragile and permeable hut for 8 days at the first blush, and it was never a shy blush, of the long Polish winter. The Kotzker, for whom the greatest pain was caused not by physical unease, but by the psychological pain of self-deception, replied that it wasn't Sukkot, but Pesach, Passover, which was the most difficult holiday to observe. Why? His students were amazed. But Rebbe, they argued, on Pesach you eat in the comfort of home, in your best clothes, surrounded by the most magnificent of your vessels, amid one's family, and eat a beautiful meal, all the while recounting the exodus from Egypt and its glories. True, replied Menachem Mendel, but it's all a lie. Do you see? One recites from the Haggadah, Avodim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. We were slaves. That's self-deception. We're still slaves. Perhaps not to the same Pharaoh, but slaves nonetheless. To deny this is a lie that all the lavish accoutrement of the Seder can never cover up. The householders and families depicted so lavishly in these manuscripts are an outcry of sorts against the inescapable realities of servitude and subjugation which existed on one level or another, even for these very wealthy patrons, in the still often dark times in which they were produced. It was good and well to be a court Jew when things were stable in the regime. Witness Samuel Oppenheimer, banker, imperial Hofaktor, diplomat, military supplier for the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, to whom he advanced considerable sums of money for the Great Turkish War. In return, he received many privileges, including the right to settle in Vienna, from which Jews had been expelled in 1670. He was allowed to bring in an entourage, including sufficient Jewish families to provide a minyan, a prayer quorum, and to build a mansion in the center of town. When in 1700 a riot broke out and the community's houses were sacked and property looted by a Christian mob, the emperor ordered one Christian hanged for sacking Oppenheimer's house and others imprisoned for participating in the disturbance. I cannot tell you how much that was the picture of privilege and preferment. But when things went wrong politically and a scapegoat was required, court Jews were often the ones who were called into account. Recall the tale of Samuel Oppenheimer's own nephew and stepson, Joseph Zus Oppenheimer, 1698 to 1738, Jewish banker and financial planner for Duke Karl Alexander of Württemberg in Stuttgart, who rose quickly to wealth and prominence, gaining a number of jealous enemies along the way. When his protectors died in 1737, Oppenheimer was arrested, accused of treason and embezzlement. Under torture, he confessed and broke down to the outrageous and scurrilous accusations leveled against him, but he refused to convert to Christianity. He was hanged after a further year of torture with the words of the Shema, the statement of the unity of God, on his lips, and his corpse was displayed in a cage in the public square of Stuttgart for 6 years, meaning that the next court Jew had to walk under it on his way to work every day. His fate became a cautionary tale for Jews attracted to the courtly life. His very name, Yud Zus, became a byword for the perils of the profession. Our illumination of the Falk family and others like them is full of lavishness, ostentation, and a sense of over-the-top fancy dress drama with all the stops pulled out. Here's some other examples. So one could argue, compellingly, here's a guy looking at his nails for Havdalah, right? That they depict the world of the wealthy patrons as it was, but it is more likely that they depict the world which the patrons wished to represent themselves as residing in. They serve to assuage the insecurities of the privileged class about their privilege and their fears of losing that privilege at any moment. In viewing these detailed and seemingly realistic portraits, we would do well to remember the quote-unquote horse portraits by artists like Stubbs. Now, before you dismiss this as a weird comparison, remember that such works are about much more than horses and their owners. They're about class, ownership, property, commodification, social status, hegemony, gender, colonization, and imperialism. They simultaneously, or if you're British, simultaneously, depict the way things, quote unquote, were, and convey specific messages about what we are to think about the owners, the masters of this extravagance of horseflesh. So-called natural history painting serves a similar purpose. It celebrates humanity's colonization of nature, its mastery over it, and its imperial hegemony, a visual manifestation of the Creator's commandment to Adam and Eve to, quote, fill the earth and master it and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and the living things that creep upon the earth. Here's another Stubbs, his portrait of the royal tiger of 1769 to 71, which depicts a Bengal tiger as the captive of the British king, a metaphor so obvious as to be positively labored. One of my favorite contemporary artists, Walton Ford, is a past master of techniques of 18th and 19th century natural history painting. He uses such methods, however, to comment on the very enterprise of natural history and to critique its cruelty, its Eurocentrism, and its utility as a metaphor for imperialist hegemony. His 10-foot wide watercolor, amazing, right? Watercolor is an unforgiving medium, called Tan Huang, 1997, depicts a tiger who is being hunted, and the thoughts of the tiger are described in the in pencil markings throughout the drawing. But in this rendering, silhouettes of historical figures and politicians associated with the Chinese, French, and American military interventions in Vietnam, for this is an Indo-Chinese tiger, right, emerge from the black stripes of the animal. So we have Ho Chi Minh, Kennedy, Nixon, Johnson, Ngo Dinh Diem, Bo Dai, Madame Nu, among others. The theme is Vietnam, the war, and its aftermath. Depicted by Ford's able brush, the bereft tiger here represents a critique rather than a celebration of imperialism. I want to take images like this, then, at less than face value. Interrogate them more thoughtfully and in a more nuanced manner. Are they straight-up reflections, there's the mirror again, right, of courtly Jewish life? Are they political allegories like Stubbs' natural history paintings? Or do they conceal ambivalences or critiques like the art of Walton Ford, right? One might imagine that critical distance and ambivalence were not possible for the denizens of 18th century, like our court Jews and like Stubbs, who were after all squarely within the culture they depict, much participant as observer. And one might argue that only 21st century people like Ford and ourselves, making our observations after the fact and with the eyes of more sophisticated outsiders, have the luxury of historical perspective and critical observation. But that is not necessarily the case. I want to give you an example of how 18th century court Jews would have been at least capable of being more Walton Ford-like or Stubbsian than quote-unquote realistic alone. Let me show you some evidence. A few years ago, many years ago, when I directed the Hebrew Books and Manuscripts Division of Sotheby's in New York, a beautiful scroll of Esther came up for sale and was ultimately purchased by the Jesselson family and displayed in an exhibition at Yeshiva University Museum. The seller presented the manuscript as a prime example of courtly Jewish taste and proudly pointed out that the two portraits in the first column could be identified as depicting the Emperor Franz Josef and Maria Theresa of Austria. This, he asserted, shows us what model citizens the Jews who commissioned this manuscript were, so patriotic and loyal that they featured images of their emperor and empress in this prominent position at the very beginning of this ritual object as a sort of tribute. I smiled to myself, thinking of the many Hanukkah lamps I had seen from Imperial Russia or Poland, surmounted by the double-headed eagle, the symbol of the state. And I imagined Jews in front of these patriotic objects singing the Hanukkah hymn, Ma'osur. You might know it, Ma'osur Yeshu Asi, right? It has a verse in it that you probably don't know what it means. I hope you don't know what it means because you might stop singing it. What the 15th century author, facing anti-Jewish persecution, wrote in that song, Le'et tachin matbeach mitzarim nabeach, means, when you, God, have prepared the slaughter of the blaspheming foe, Then I shall complete. Zegmor, Bishir, Mizmor, Chanukah, Mizbeach. I shall complete with a song and a hymn the dedication of the altar, right? To the mind of the 15th century author of these lines, Hanukkah, the dedication of the altar, cannot truly and wholeheartedly be celebrated until such a time when God, note, not the Jews, but God, will wreak bloody vengeance upon the latter-day enemies of the Jewish people. The irony present and inherent in the juxtaposition of the words of the hymn and the lighting the Hanukkah lamps surmounted by the Austro-Hungarian eagle would certainly not have been lost on those Russian and Polish Jews. It would have been at that moment that their ardent and sincere desire to be respected citizens of the empire would perhaps have clashed with their often bitter experience of Jews in exile. You don't have to think far. You can be a Jew, and you can have extreme compassion for terrible things going on in the world today, sometimes in the name of Jews. On the other hand, you can feel extremely loyal to and defensive of the only Jewish polity that exists, right? These torn feelings are not uncommon among intelligent people. So when I saw this scroll of Esther, I recalled those lamps, and I noted to myself that it was small wonder that Jews commissioning such a lavish Megillah scroll simultaneously celebrated the Austrian emperor and empress by depicting them in the first column, but also criticized them in a veiled commentary obvious to readers of Hebrew. To show the emperor next to the first mention in the text of the tyrannical or stultified King Ahasuerus, who, right? And it happened in the days of Ahasuerus, right? The drunken or stupid emperor, and the empress next to the first depiction of the intemperate and disobedient Queen Vashti. I mean, we love her today because we're feminists, right? But in the text, she's a bad person, right? She's intemperate and disobedient, right? That's a joke, right? There's a too hearty laughter here, concealing beneath it an essential and underlying anxiety and even terror. I noted this, as I say to myself. I never discussed it with the buyer, and as far as I know, my observation was not duplicated by the very competent catalogers at Yeshiva University. Perhaps it's better that way. Judaica sells better when it's more of a hit, and is more of a hit, I should say, with the museum going public when it demonstrates how well assimilated Jews were. It is understandably more palatable when not proclaiming God's bloody vengeance on the Gentiles. So I feel that closer scrutiny is a desideratum in order to determine whether these images of beautiful people in their magnificent clothes, in their exquisite homes, surrounded by stunning objects, right, have the same Fordian darker side as the Indus-Chinese tiger, the patriotic Chanukiot, and the Megillot we've been discussing. But this afternoon, I'd be pleased and content if you agreed with me that we have at least established the following, repeating what we said all the way at the beginning of the talk. Whether these depictions are relatively close to or wildly imaginatively distant from reality, they serve first and foremost not to illustrate history, but to expose the inner lives of the people who inspired and paid for these exquisite volumes. Remember Bernard Berenson, art is not based on actuality, but on the wishes, dreams, and aspirations of a people. Sometimes it's more important even than being able to accurately reconstruct the realities of their lives. It's nearly always more intriguing and elusive. Thank you very much. As the lights slowly come up, we will entertain some questions. Please make your questions questions and not excurses for a future doctorate, right? Or, Okay, shall I?
Pass over over you.
I think
really quick,
Paige is circulating among you with the microphone. Excellent. You're really good at that. You should do cable. Do we have cable anymore? Is there cable? I don't know.
Had their hand up.
Right.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. My question is, I believe at the beginning of your talk you explained that the Jewish families who wanted to commission these manuscripts would go to non-Jewish manuscript makers and, and pay for them. Mm-hmm. So to what extent, and this weaves into the whole issue of representational versus aspirational,
right.
To what extent did the Jews or who commissioned these works have artistic control over the specific images and what is shown in these, because you've been talking, in great detail about specific, implements, et cetera, et cetera.
Correct.
So that's one question. The other
is... Let's go slow. Let's start with the one question, okay? Because I can't answer two questions at once. So we'll start with the first question. So I happen to know that you recently, Mazel Tov, commissioned a home from Frank Gehry, the famous architect, I understand? Mazel Tov. And in that home, when you commissioned Frank Gehry, Frank Gehry happens to be Jewish. I thought he was Irish all these years. Turns out he's Jewish. You said to Frank, you're a genius. I'm paying you $6 billion for this house. Put as many bathrooms as you like and paint the children's rooms. Don't even ask me how many children I have. Just decide how many children's rooms there should be and paint them whatever colors you want. And I might want a Viking stove or a Kenmore, but you make the decision because you're the genius. So when you pay to commission a manuscript like this, the Golden Haggadah, for instance, with the frogs, remember that? That would have been the equivalent of $600,000 in those times, in a time where people earned probably the equivalent of $1 a year. When you commission something like that, you have complete artistic control. You don't just go in there and say, do whatever you want. You say, do what I tell you. And the person who's making it says, yes, thank you, and does not ask you necessarily, well, what do you mean? You put a dog here. Is that a reference to Count Ergelong, Or this illustration of Pharaoh looks a little bit like the king. I'm nervous about that. Nope, they did what they were asked. And we have a lot of evidence about that from various different ways we can sort of dig deep into commission. So because these things were very expensive, the patron had a lot of jurisdiction, and we can sort of retroject and understand how they were put together. That's my answer to that. Second question, go ahead.
In terms of the Hebrew
Yeah.
writing, so was that, because some of these images are purely images, but some of them are interspersed with, phrases, etc. Was that something that, did the Christian manuscript makers, had they mastered the art of Hebrew calligraphy, or was this done in conjunction with Jews? How did that work?
The Hebrew writing in the main body of the text, thank you, was done by Jewish scribes, and often the captions were put in by Jewish scribes, or in the case of the Griffin's Head Haggadah, a few years later, when it was people no longer understood what was going on, maybe, or it was unclear, somebody came about 200 years later, is my estimate from the quality of the ink, and wrote down, this is Moses, this is, Aaron, so a Jew, just writing on the, after the fact, post facto, as we say in Latin. Okay, great questions. Okay, and we have another victim. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I have two, I think, quick questions. I may have missed it, but did you say why the Griffin Haggadah is griffins?
I did
we
not.
know?
You'll have to come back for another lecture. I can't. What'd you pay, 25 to 35, I think? I think that's a $50 question. I can't get into that. Paige will take your contributions on the way out. If enough people are interested, I'll tell the story. Yes, your second question? Go ahead.
The Falk Haggadah with the family in that very extravagant house. Were there Jews at that time in that place that were that wealthy?
Yeah, sure. If you could afford to commission a manuscript, you were that wealthy. But as I said, you were that wealthy, but you were also very precarious. So, the Jews were expelled from England in 1290, right? But then Queen Elizabeth, when is Queen Elizabeth? 1500s, right? Her physician is a guy named Roberto Lopez, who's Portuguese. Portuguese was code for a Jew. Right? He was doing very well. He went to Mass, and then he came home and said Kiddush, But when Queen Elizabeth got ill, they accused him, as her body physician, of poisoning her and put him to death. So, you could do well as a Jew, but you were precarious. It was not so easy, right? Okay, we have somebody down here and up there. Go ahead. Oh, look, we have two. This is amazing.
Two microphones.
Is this, you guys, you could have like a second career in this, yes.
Are these manuscripts extremely rare, since you said that there weren't many court Jews?
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen an ox? Have you ever seen an ox? Yes or no?
I can't remember.
You can't
whether
remember seeing an ox, okay.
Yeah.
So an ox, if you didn't grow up on a farm, is an animal that's about this high at the shoulders, a big animal. And there's something called a particular kind of ox cart, right? And it is, I'm going to stray from the microphone, but you can see me at home. Hi, Mom. So it's like from here to here, and it has wheels that are taller than me, which is easy because I'm a short Jew, okay? And it's pulled by between 6 and 8 oxen, okay? Something like 24 ox carts full of Jewish books were burned in the Place d'Hôtel de Ville, which is now called, what's called the Place d'Hôtel de Ville was called the Place de Grève in Paris by a man called Louis IX. Catholics call him Saint Louis. Louis IX in the year 1242. And when I go to Paris, I go to see Notre Dame, and then I go around to see the city hall, which is on that Place d'Hôtel de Ville. And in the winter, there's an ice skating rink there, right? But I can't stand there even in the cold because my feet are burning, because I know that all those books were burned. And they weren't just tamped down in these 12 ox carts, they were piled up. And that was only the Jewish books in the Ile-de-France, this small area in Paris, right? That was so many books. So they were not rare. Jews owned more books than anybody, right? But they were destroyed, and as a result, they are rare. So what we have is the tip of a very big and dirty and unknown iceberg that exists no longer.
Thank you.
That's the long answer. It started with an ox. You oxed. I had to answer. That's good. I just flew in from New York, and boy, are my arms tired. Yes,
I
go
have
ahead.
a question.
Yes.
Why can't it be both representation and projection?
I'm not, very good. I'm not arguing that it isn't representation. All I argued with Vivian insisted that this family who commissioned this manuscript owned that cup. I'm agnostic. I'm agnostic on that score. I can't say it. Of course it is. Of course it reflects, right? But the reason you choose to depict yourself a certain way, in other words, I don't know, like let's say you have really terrible taste, right? And you want to commission a portrait of yourself, like you're a president of the United States with very terrible taste, and you want to show yourself, I don't know, in front of your hideous golf club, right? To show what kind of person you are, right? You're not simply depicting, you could have done it anywhere, right? But you make a choice when you commission art, right? You say, I want to be remembered, with my hair in this way, on my horse in this way, in front of this building in this way, right? And that's what I'm arguing. It's aspirational, it's memorial. It also reflects, that you do have a hideous golf club. Geh gesundheit, as we say in Yiddish. Go be happy with your golf club, right?
Right.
I mean, by club, I don't mean like something you hit with. I mean,
I was actually thinking about how sometimes when you see, pictures or depictions of African American slaves, and
Yes.
they're so happy picking cotton, and,
Right.
and we all understand that to be, that's not true,
Right.
but we still say, okay, what's the age range in this picture of people who are picking cotton? What are the tools they're using, et
Yes.
cetera? And we're always so willing to do that for certain ethnic or racial groups, but
Right.
then we aren't for Jews.
Right,
You
because
know
we
what I
assume
mean?
that
It's like-
Jews were a certain way, right? So
Right,
there
but
are a
it's-
lot of
yeah.
there are a lot of assumptions about Jewish wealth that are, growing up where I grew up, I saw a lot of poverty, and there still is. So yes, art is mineable for realia, but it's more often and more interestingly mineable for a certain mental state on the part of the people who commissioned it. Those images of enslaved Africans, right, who were not yet African Americans because were not enfranchised, you know what I'm saying? So they were like, people were stolen from Africa, literally, right, kidnapped. They weren't commissioned by those people. They were commissioned by the enslavers, right? So, okay,
Okay,
other
we've got
questions?
one last question all the way in the back.
Okay.
When you were talking about the doctor,
Yeah.
Roberto Lopez, and Queen Elizabeth, can you elaborate on why you were saying to be Portuguese was to be a Jew?
Well, the ancestors of many of the Jews who were in England, there were a few Jews who had come from Northern Europe to Italy. Most of the Jews who were in England were of Spanish and Portuguese origin, right? And the Western Sephardic tradition, of which I myself am a part, is I'm a man of many parts, has a long history, including the Jews who lived in Spain. And to be Portuguese, of course, Portugal and Spain were the enemies of England, right? But there were Portuguese, quote-unquote, refugees in England, many of whom were the remnants of the Jewish community who had been expelled, who lived secretly as Jews, though publicly as Christians. Hope that helps.
All right. Thank you so much for coming today, and a huge thank you to Marc for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you. My great pleasure.